everyone, and welcome to Talking Acquisition. This is our weekly high-energy, informative, and slightly opinionated view on all things acquisition, procurement, and government contracting related. This is the place where the contracting community, the acquisition community, and our industry partners can connect, talk, listen, and learn from each other. My name is William Randolph, and I am your host, and I would love to introduce my co-host, my colleague, my partner, and my friend, Soraya Carrera. Hello, Soraya. How are you?
Hello, Will. How are you? I'm doing great.
Great.
Looking forward to a great conversation this week.
Yes, I think one that may be quite near and dear to our hearts is I think both of us at some points in our career have played a bit on the programmatic side, or at least had colleagues that have played in the programmatic side, and particularly the relationship between the two. I believe one of the most valuable and highly leveraged relationships in the acquisition life cycle and in an environment. What are your thoughts on that? What about programmatics?
Definitely. I couldn't agree more. The relationship between the program manager and the procurement team is so important. I can't emphasize that enough. Recognizing, understanding who your program managers are, what is important to them, what their priorities are, enabling them, helping them define their requirements is a key role that we play. And I think that's extremely important. But before we start the conversation, I have to do my podcast disclaimer.
I was too
For
excited.
any new listeners, the people that have heard us before are probably going, oh, come on, not her again. But anyway, so for those of you that are joining us for the first time, thank you for joining us. And for those of you that are returning, we appreciate the support. Our podcast shares information and views on a variety of topics that impact the federal acquisition community. Our goal is to provide thought leadership and perspective, not to criticize, judge, or render political opinions, although every now and then you might hear one or two. We provide this free service because we are former federal acquisition professionals and leaders. We believe that the creativity, innovation, and effectiveness of our community is unleashed when we share knowledge, information, and learning. We hope you enjoy our podcast, and we welcome the views and comments of our colleagues across the private and public sectors. So with that, Will, why don't you lead us off on the program management conversation?
Thank you. Well, here's my observation. At year 23 in my career was the first time I had the opportunity to actually work in a program office. And I tell you, after that experience, I wish I would have done it so much earlier in my career. What I found out is there's a different set of motivations and incentives on the program office side of the house. I often used to think and say, why do those interesting program people do the things that they do and say the things that they say and care about, or more importantly, and from my vantage point at the time, not care about the things that I care about? And it was because they had their own set of incentives and motivations. Not that they didn't care about ours, but they were just different. And I tell you, living in the tent, being the program office, going from Friday as the director of contracts to Monday, then being the consumer of the services, it was an eye-opening experience for me.
I have to tell you, same thing happened to me. And I was fortunate. I think you know a lot about my early career. I started out as a clerk typist and then moved into contracting. But when I worked for Navy in my first career procurement professional job, I was actually embedded in the program office. So I had the opportunity to really see that perspective from the beginning. And then roughly about 20 years, almost 20 years later, I would become a program manager,
right,
and live that life. And two things struck me, like you. The thinking is different. The motivations are different. The incentives are different, but the problems are pretty much the same. There's
Absolutely.
Somebody demanding something from you, asking for the near impossible to be done in an improbable schedule, and you have to do it within budget, although the budget was never really carved out based on the program that they're asking you to manage.
Yes.
And that'll make sense in a minute. But I also found that we, the procurement community, have to know how to talk to the program. We have to know how to communicate with one another. And you know that that's always a thread of mine in almost everything that I talk about, that communications really do matter. The art of speaking to one another, speaking in the same language,
Right.
but listening to one another and understanding one another. And very early on in my career, that was something that I learned, that you had to know what questions to ask. You had to know how to get the information you needed out of your program offices, because they're not thinking about a contract, not the way you and I
That's
think
the way
about
we
it.
think about it.
They're
Right.
thinking about an objective that needs to be fulfilled.
Yeah.
A requirement that needs to be delivered. Let's use that word. It is a requirement that they need. And we have to help them understand how we can fulfill those requirements, how we can best approach it. And I used to often tell folks that I led, people that I managed, that one of the things I learned very early on in my career is that the moment I referenced the FAR, I just lost the conversation. Because to them, FAR is opposite of near.
Yeah.
And that's what it should be. And I'm not
Yeah.
saying, look, I don't mean that to be disrespectful to the program managers. Many of them are extremely talented. They know the federal acquisition regulation, they understand it, but that's not what they're there to do. That's
Correct.
our job.
Yeah.
They're there to deliver on a particular program, a particular set of requirements, and we have to enable them to do that. And we have to work together to find that right partnership and that right definition of those requirements within the right contractual instrument and the right evaluation strategy and approach to get them the best solution.
Yeah.
I think that's an extremely important element of understanding. And I will tell you that I encourage folks that work in procurement to spend some time in a program office, and those who
Absolutely.
work in a program office to spend some time in procurement.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I was thinking back on some of the experiences I had in my earlier career, and I felt like it was a lot easier when I was in a DoD environment, that you could go visit the plane, visit the ship, visit the boat, and you could get firsthand, because I was in Navy early in my career, first 10 years of my career, and we were constantly in the field, touching and rubbing and kicking and feeling what the requirements looked like, and then seeing them being engaged with users, warfighter, the pointing end, we used to call it the pointing end of the spear. What those individuals, what those sailors were doing on those vessels and platforms and ships and weapon systems. And it was so enlightening. So when you came back to the office, it was like, oh, let's go. I know why I'm doing this. I've always found it was a little bit harder in the civilian side, but we always tried to make that connection to mission. I'm sure in your experience, or at least in times of your leadership, you've tried to encourage people to get out into the field and experience the program.
Not just the people, but even the leaders, because you have to really identify with them. So you have to understand why is it that they're trying to do what they do?
Yeah.
Why is this important to them? Why does it have to be this way? I love to tell the story when I was at ICE and we did one of our first strategically sourced vehicles at DHS. It was for handguns. And the gentleman who I was working with happened to be one of the firearms experts. In fact, he ran one of our firearms training center. And he walked into my office, it's a true story, with the police, and he put it down on the table because I had called him and I said, I need you to help me understand why we have to be so specific about this firing pin and this thing and that thing. And he said, okay. And he opened this valise and he had several handguns and he opened them up and broke them down for me. I was like, this is impressive. I like this. And I knew more about handguns than I ever wanted to know in a lifetime. But the point is, I understood because it's the visual that you get. That visual stays with you. Every time that I was picking up that solicitation or reviewing documents associated with that procurement, I was seeing that equipment. Similarly, when we were buying tactical communications equipment, same thing. They came in and showed me what tactical communications equipment looks like, right? How we buy these things, how we use these things, and seeing it, touching it, and feeling it is totally different experience. And once you have that in your head, you get it. You get the mission, you get why it's important, and it does help you refocus and rethink and try to be a little bit more innovative and creative. I really believe that. Right?
Yeah.
To ask why can't we do it this way or why can't we do it that way? The other thing that I would say from a program manager perspective, when you sit in a program office, you start to understand all of us, when we work in government, we all have different pressures. There's the pressures of the budget, there's the pressures of compliance, there's the pressures of oversight, and of course, the pressures of getting the job done. And a program office has all those same pressures, maybe even more.
Yeah.
maybe even more, because depending on what they're doing, people's lives are at stake.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just about Congress and it's not just about compliance. People's lives. Think about what FEMA does. Think about what ICE does,
Absolutely.
what CBP does, what FBI does. These Secret Service and
Secret
all of it,
Service. Yeah.
these are people's lives in their hands. And when you start to understand that, when you really feel that, you start to understand we got to find a way. We got to find a way to make it happen. And we have to find a way to make it happen within the schedule that they need it.
Yeah. Agreed. Agreed. So Soraya, what are your thoughts about, in some instances, I have heard, or at least had the relationship between contracts and program offices being described as adversarial. I've never found that word fits, because I think it's just different incentives. But why do you think sometimes we miss the mark on creating understanding and empathy, that truly I understand. I've walked in your shoes, so I understand. Any thoughts on why you think we missed the mark?
Because I think sometimes we focus too much on what we're trying to achieve and not what the big we needs to achieve, as I used to like to say. In other words, you focus on here's what I have to do, here's the parameters that I have to meet, or the things that I have to do to be able to write the solicitation and get the contract awarded by X date. And we're not necessarily thinking about how it impacts them.
Right.
And I think the best relationships are when you understand one another. When you understand, I need this from you so that I can do this and get this back to you, when you can get through that description of the process. I always tried to open the discussion with my customers, even when I was a contracting officer, about the process. I would say, well, here's what we've got to do. And here's what I'm going to need from you. Here's what I'm going to have to do. And here's where I'm going to need, here are the pain points where we're going to have to exchange information.
Sure.
Or here's the kind of information I need. I also, one of the things that I tried to avoid doing, and I know I'll get some criticism for this, I tried not to just throw a template at somebody to fill out.
Agreed.
I used to try to say, look, here's the kind of info I need. Here's the template that we're going to put it in, but here's what I'm looking for in these areas. And if I had a customer that just couldn't get it done, rather than bang my head up against the wall arguing with them, I sometimes would say, let's sit down and do this together.
Yeah, let's grab it. Yeah.
Let's sit down and crank this out. But I think that is the issue, is that lack of understanding for one another. I will tell you, Dr. Michael Wooden, who was the former head of OFPP, and I think OFPP is still continuing this, frictionless acquisition. He called it friction. He didn't call it adversarial. He called it friction. There was a friction. And I think that makes a little bit of sense if you think about it.
It does.
The program is trying to get something accomplished and get something done. We're trying to tell them, well, we got to comply with all these rules, right? We got to do set-asides, we got to do all these things. Sure. And sometimes we lead with the rule and not the objective. Yeah. And what I always tried to tell people was, let's lead with the objective.
Yeah. You know, one of the things I have also found when you talk about leading with the objective is there are the group of people inside the program office that I think are indispensable, and those are the cores. Mm-hmm. I believe that government has yet to fully unlock the value, particularly in a post-award environment, of what our cores could be. I just think that knowing, having eyes and ears, truly, I think it's actually described in the FAR as, you know, contracting officer representatives being the eyes and ears of the contracting officer when that individual is not available. That contracting officer is not available to be eyes and ears inside of a program office or inside the mission, you know, truly forward-leaning mission part. Yeah. I think the value of cores is just amazing. And I know DHS has done some amazing work in the core space when you were at DHS. Anything drove that, or did you see the same kind of value? Sure.
So first of all, recognizing the value of the core. Let's realistically talk about roles and responsibilities for a moment. Yeah. If I could digress there. You have the contracting officer and you have the program manager. If you ever read the list of competencies and requirements that are imposed on these individuals, what they have to do, it's insane. It's insane. Okay.
Yeah, both lists are insane.
The list just keeps growing, right? The list keeps growing. Every time somebody does something crazy in one place, Congress passes legislation, or a GAO study comes in and says you got to issue a policy to do blah blah blah. And so the the requirements keep growing. Even though the staff isn't growing, the number of people isn't growing, the requirements are growing. And this is where the COR becomes extremely important, because there needs to be somebody there that can help those two positions.
Yeah.
And what I noticed in the program management and program management improvement and accountability act, I never get it right, PMIA, that was passed, I think about 3-4 years ago. One of the things that they emphasized was getting those core competencies identified.
Yep.
And I was recently looking at the fact that GAO or OMB, OPM put out the core competencies, and one of the core competencies, contracting. They have to understand contracting.
Yeah.
And that's extremely true. Like, they have to understand financial management.
Yeah.
You cannot
Agreed.
manage a program where
Right.
you utilize and rely on the resources of contractors and not understand contract management. And because you're managing a budget, you better understand financial management. So the core is that person that actually sits there and supports both sides. And they're the person that has to understand the contract, but also has to understand the requirements. And they can enable the delivery of those requirements within the confines of that contract, or they can work with the program manager and the contracting officer and the contractor to identify where changes are needed. Because you know what? Inevitably, changes are needed.
They are.
By the way, if somebody says to me, I awarded that contract a year ago, we never wrote a change, I'm a little suspect. Like, how'd you do that?
Right.
Time does not stand still, and nor do requirements, right? And so that's why you got to build flexibility into the contracts. You really have to understand the mission, and you have to understand the nuances of that mission, right? You have to know to say, well, how will this change? In 6 months, will this be the same? In 12 months, will this be the same?
Yeah.
How are you going to pay for this?
Absolutely.
Right? How do you buy this? How do you pay for it? What kind of talent? Do people have to sit on site, or can they be off site?
Yeah.
Right? These are the questions that you have to ask. You have to put yourself, that's that empathy, right? You got to put yourself in the role of that program manager and say, what are the questions that I need answered to be able to write them a better contract? By the way, just a general comment. I found whenever there's a write-up out there about a bad contract, it's not about the contract. It's about the requirement. Most of the time, it's about the requirement. Right? It's about, we didn't get the requirement right, or we didn't have the right schedule, or we didn't consider all the steps in the process. It's really about the requirement. It's not that the contract was lacking terms and conditions. It was that they were either not articulated in a way that they could fulfill the requirement, or we weren't monitoring the performance in a way to catch errors.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I can recall there are times when I've had to I'll call referee conversations. There's times you have to put on the striped jacket and the whistle and referee those discussions. But what I found oftentimes, it was a lack of communication that contributed to the misunderstandings. People were talking past each other in their own languages. And the thing I love about the cores is that cores are one of the I like to think, to fully realize their value, they have to speak both languages.
Right.
They have to have enough of both to be interpreters both ways, because just as we say, the motivations and incentives are different, cost, schedule, performance on the program management side, being able to talk, compliance, economics and strategy on the contract side is just as valuable, and knowing who can do what to whom when, that's a valuable proposition in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. One of the things that I always thought was important was when you're doing your acquisition planning, you want the core in the room with that program manager, because the core has the experience of having managed the previous agreement in some cases, or if not, they know what they're going to have to take on.
Right.
And they may have ideas on things that we should be doing in the contract or part of the evaluation to make life better post-award, right? So I always think it's important that the core be a part of that contracting team at the earliest of stages, when you're planning the acquisition, as you're building your solicitation, and then obviously as you awarded, and then contract administration. The other thing that I think sometimes often happens is sometimes people see the core as the paper pusher of the contract, meaning, oh, they're there to make sure the invoice gets paid, or they're there to make sure that, if the vendor needs a copy of this or that. No, the core is really there to get the contractor to comply with performance.
Absolutely.
That's
Absolutely.
really what they're there to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that means that they do have to have some level of technical understanding and some level of technical understanding on the program as well as the contracting side.
Yeah.
And they become an important part of our community. So one of the things that I always try to do was embrace the core, to include them, to try to invite them to our training, to have them engaged in our conversations, and in fact, include them in a lot of the source materials that we put out, even for our contracting officers, to say, we should have cores perhaps participate in this training, or let's create a version that's for the core, right? Because they may not need to know all the technical nuances that we need to know, but help them understand, like, what's Buy American? How does that work? How do you comply with labor laws? I think that's extremely important.
Yeah. One of the things that I've seen in the core environment is this willingness to be truly the person that's manning the gate in terms of post-award activity. All the sexy stuff happens pre-award. That's when everybody gets recognized and get plaques and certificates and all that stuff, and get write-ups in articles and periodicals and stuff. It's all great. But as soon as that contract award, it gets awarded, it gets really real. And that's where I still think there is so much value to be unlocked by fostering that community, giving them the strategies, tactics, and tools they need to be effective. I think it's still value that's yet to be unlocked. You had mentioned something about the PMIAA. And one of the things in there, it talks about maturing the programmatics in civilian agencies. One of the things, at least from my experience, is that in DoD, they have quite robust programmatic and program manager lines of business, in training and development. What do you think is that a good idea to leverage that to have professional program managers, or is the civilian model of, hey, these are users and any user can get the rose pin on them and become a program manager? Any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, no, definitely. I definitely subscribe to the principles of the DoD model. Theirs is a little bit more complex because they buy more
rigid,
things, right? Yeah. They buy, and they buy things that are longer term and far more elaborate sometimes and sophisticated. But I certainly am a proponent of the program management discipline. I believe that program managers should be certified and credentialed. And it's not just enough to train them. It's get them the experience working on programs. We have a lot of folks out there, and again, I don't want to offend anybody. We got a lot of folks that are very well trained, have never managed a program.
Right.
And you don't want to cut your teeth on the first $1 billion program they hand you, right?
Right.
So I do think that there's a logical progression there, that we train them and we try to make sure we get them assigned to serve on programs in various roles, to kind of come up through the ranks of the program management side, much like we do with our contracting professionals. It's one of the things that I felt, and this is an opinion now, I'm going to be very opinionated here. I felt that they could have done a better job in the PMIA, and I actually brought this up to a couple of people when I was reviewing drafts of it, that I felt they really should create a new category of labor called program management and then get people into it. Because right now, a lot of people use like the 343 and a couple of those
340 series.
Yeah. How are you going to distinguish between the folks that have just a lot of training and have never done any program management to the folks that really have done program management? Yeah. So I'm a huge advocate of the discipline. I believe it's good to have that program management policy and to have standards that have to be complied with as you're developing your program, to make sure that you have the right level of documentation, the right level of scrutiny on the program. Now, that said, that doesn't mean we need reams of paper. Similar to my philosophy about acquisition plans and other documents that we prepare in government, I don't need it to be 500 pages long. Sure. You can write it on the back of a napkin as long as you're conveying the strategy, right? And I hate to say it that way, but sometimes we spend a lot of time putting a lot of paper together that says nothing.
Yeah.
I want paper
Agreed.
that says something, right?
Yeah.
So I think program management as a discipline is an extremely important discipline. It's something that DoD does well. We need to take that and tailor it to the civilian agencies. And in fact, at DHS, we did that. In fact, when we stood up the department, it was Management Directive 102. And even in and of itself, over the years, it has actually evolved quite a bit.
Yes, it has.
Including that we broke out,
Yes.
IT separate from other programs because IT programs are very different, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the right way to go. You got to tailor that program management directive and that discipline to be what it needs to be for the civilian agencies. But definitely, I wholeheartedly support having the discipline, having the certification, having the proper level of training, and ensuring you got your policies and your procedures stood up, and then a good oversight, internal oversight program to
Yeah.
make sure that the big programs are being looked at.
Yeah, get the attention they need.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're getting the attention that they need, and that the decision makers are aware of where those programs are headed. Because you know what? One of the things that I've seen is all too often, in fact, you hear this in the news and the chatter when they talk about, the Build Back Better plan and others. When you start a lot of new programs in government, they
Yeah.
don't tend to go away. People tend to be very hesitant to,
Yeah.
cut them. And if a program's not going well, you sometimes have to say, stop. Let's revisit. Let's
Yeah.
go look and see where we change course. What do we need to do? And I saw us doing that more and more at DHS over the years. It's a tough thing to do. I'm going to
Oh,
tell you,
of course.
it's hard.
Yes.
It's hard because programs are programs. I
Yeah.
won't tell you what I used to call them, but anyway, programs are programs. And they have a life and they have a constituency, right?
Yeah.
And look, ultimately they are for the users, although sometimes they forget to include the users, right? But they really ultimately are there to serve the users, to help fulfill a mission. So I think it is important that you periodically assess your programs, determine what's going right, identify where it's not. Sometimes you got to replace the team. Sometimes you got to change the team out. Sometimes it's just burnout, right? Sometimes it's not the right leadership. There's many reasons why programs sometimes run afoul. What always bothers me is that we do get recognized for that great program work we do when it goes wrong. Have you ever noticed that? Everybody writes a report about the one that went wrong. How about you write one about the one that went right?
Where we actually won. Yeah, agreed.
Exactly. One where it actually worked and they delivered. I mean, I say that often in federal government. I've always said, everybody talks about the bad news. Nobody ever says what was done right. And so people are left, the people who don't really know how government works, they're left with this thought, oh my God, look at what they messed up. And what they don't understand, that represented one out of 150 other
Absolutely.
things where 149 of them went really, really well, or 149 individuals were great leaders.
Absolutely.
It'd be nice to see people write up synopses of programs that went well.
That went well.
Successful, that delivered, that met the customer need, that really saved the taxpayer dollars, that made life better.
Yeah, you speak in my language now, because I always railed against not only the bad news story, but the myriad of urban legends that follow. It's this must have been the problem, so we're not going to do this. This
and
must
all of
have
them
been
do it that way now. One guy did one thing wrong, one man or woman did something wrong, and now the rest of them.
That's right. Everybody pays. Everybody pays.
I do think that we don't do enough of that. We don't think about all the really good things that are done. And I always, because I came from DHS and I was there for a long time, I have to lean back and say FEMA. Look at FEMA. When you read, they don't write the great stories about what FEMA really did. They talk about that one little contract that maybe they didn't get right. Or that one little bottle of water that didn't get to Bobby Joe, who just yelled louder than the other people, the other 150 people that actually did get the water. And that's just an example. But CBP, look at what they highlight. They don't highlight all the great things that are being done. So that's always been a pet peeve of mine. But I'm a huge believer in the program management discipline. I was excited when I had the opportunity to go into it. I spent 10 years. I don't know if you knew that. I spent about 10 years in program management. I worked in IT, then I worked in finance for a while, doing program management activities, helping manage financial systems. And then when I left OPO as head of contracting, when I went to USCIS, I went back into program management, with records management and verification systems. And I always just found it refreshing to go back into the program because it made me think about the role of procurement.
Yes.
And how to serve the customer.
Yes.
And a couple of times people caught me saying to some of our contracting officers, you should hear how you talk to your program. You should hear the words that you use.
Yep.
If you sat at this side of the table as a program,
yeah,
and you heard what you said, you would change your vocabulary. And that was something I focused on quite a bit. Talk to them as a customer, help them, guide them, enable them, right? And to the programs, I would say, please don't be rude to your contracting officers. I did have a few program officials that would just claim, well, you contracting people. That was like my least favorite place. You contracting people would set my hair on fire,
yeah,
set off my Puerto Rican temper, and I program people.
Right, I got it.
How we talk to one another is extremely important because we are on the same team and we are trying to achieve the same objectives. Sometimes I do, and there are contracting folks that sometimes procrastinate and don't ask the right questions or ask the wrong questions, right? They don't take the right approach with the customer.
Sure.
And there are programs that also don't know how to approach a contracting officer. And I think it's important that we teach people that communication skill. And I'm always glad to see that when it's listed under the key, what do you call them? The general competencies, communication, decision-making, problem solving. Like, well, that's great core competence. Can we teach them?
Imagine that. Well, Soraya, it's that time again, as we always say, our greatest challenge is stopping. So at this point, it's golden nugget time. What's the golden nugget for our community in regards to programmatics, program management, contracting management relationship? What's the golden nugget for you?
For me, the golden nugget is always understand the mission. If you have the opportunity to go sit with the program, hear their objectives firsthand, and not just like some quick speech. I mean, really get in there and try to understand their mission, what their focus is, and what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
That's how you're going to be successful. You have to adopt that mission. I always adopted my customer's mission. No mission was insignificant to me ever.
Yeah. Awesome. Mine a slight extension of that. Be inquisitive. Be inquisitive. Ask the questions, not so much as a why, but as a how. What do you mean? And that's a huge shift from why. People often get offensive or at least defensive with why, because people think you're asking or challenging the position. I was like, what do you mean? And a couple of those will get to the root of what the real issues are, and that's where the value can be unlocked. So to our community, be inquisitive, in both directions. Be inquisitive of the relationship.
Hey, if I could be touchy-feely, show some love to one another.
Yeah, it's okay.
Love your contract, love your COR. Yeah. I really mean it. We're in this together, and let's respect one another. And please don't forget your contractor either, because you know what happens when you award that contract? They have to deliver, and
they have to go execute.
Us, program manager, the COR, the contracting officer, working with the contractor that delivers success.
Absolutely. And with that, I think we're done. Thank you again for another amazing week and another amazing podcast. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for hosting, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
All right. Be well, and we'll see everybody next week.
See you next week.
Bye-bye.